Shall we start? Okay. One last sip of my tea here. I must say, I love traveling in a country where they provide milk with the tea. You always have to ask in the US for milk with your tea. I was in London a few weeks ago, and they also provide milk with the tea, and it's just very nice. Okay, that's a little aside.
You're easily pleased.
I'm sorry?
Easily pleased.
Yeah, I suppose so. It's the small things that make me happy. All right. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to, okay, so let me just take a vote before we go on, because we've got another, hour and 20 minutes. How much would you like to hear lots of things about individual and cultural variability in the neural findings, and how much would you like to hear about, applying these ideas to, children's artwork and stuff like that? Probably. Which
Application.
Application. Okay, great. Good. So what I'm going to do next is a little bit more about the neural findings to give you a sense of, because we haven't really talked about the neural basis of that sense of self yet. And I think that that is something that really has potential implications for the way that we interact with kids and for the environments that we design for kids to learn in and to live in. Again, I have a new paper on this in case anybody's interested. It's under review right now, but you can still get it off my website if you ask me, called Rest is Not Idleness is the name of the paper. And then we talk about the brain data that I'm about to show you here and make some prescriptions for education, which I hope all of you will try to test and then tell me how it goes, because I haven't tested them. They're just ideas that come from the brain science, so I'd love to know what you think. Okay. In order to be able to understand the next part, you have to kind of let your caffeine sink in for a second, and let me show you something about the scientific design of the experiment, okay? And so I told you that we induced emotions in an experiment where people sit with me for like 2.5 hours. I show them a series of stories, so don't tell them what emotions were meant to induce by the stories. I just say, how does this story make you feel? And then they tell me, and then we go to the next one. And unbeknownst to them, the stories are actually designed. They're written and piloted to, tested to be in one of 5 categories, okay? And they're all mixed up. You've heard a story that's meant to induce admiration for virtue, which is the lady in Sudan. You've heard a story which is meant to induce compassion for social or psychological pain, which is the young man in China, right? There's no physical pain in that situation. He's perfectly well fed now. He's perfectly happy. He's just sitting watching a video. All of the pain that you empathize with is mental. Does that make sense? And likewise, the woman here in Sudan, it's nothing that she's showing you in her actions that is particularly admirable. It's not the way she holds that book or talks to those people. I mean, that's nice. It's nice to be a skilled doctor, but lots of people are skilled obstetricians. I mean, that's admirable, but not hugely so, right? What makes her so remarkable is the cumulative circumstances that she has overcome and experienced and grown through to become the person that she is now. That's what makes her remarkable. So what we're looking at in both of these cases, both of those kinds of stories, is the constellation of past circumstances organized together, coordinated together into a complex understanding that lets you appreciate the mental qualities and capacities and pains and rewards of a particular person. Does that make sense? So we were interested in understanding how those kinds of emotions, which are purely about the mind, may still ground themselves in the body. This was Antonio Damasio's idea when I came to study with him as a postdoc, and I kind of took it in this direction. But his idea was that we are still using the physical body as a platform on which to appreciate other people's minds, even though the emotions we're having have nothing to do with your physical situation. So in order to tease that apart scientifically, I designed a study where we contrast versions of either painful emotions, pain-based aspects of compassion, where you're sharing another person's pain, or sort of reward-based aspects of success and pleasurableness, okay? Because in the nervous system, and evolutionarily speaking, pain versus reward is a very, very fundamental distinction in our brain, right? You go towards reward and things that are good for you, and you avoid things that are painful and bad for you. Even like a little amoeba in a petri dish, if you make it a little too warm on one side or a little too acidic, they over to the other side, right? We go where circumstances suit us. And sometimes, for those of you who work in clinical settings, sometimes we learn such atypical maladaptive ways to be able to make circumstances suit us because the social experiences we've had have been so bad for us, really, that we actually develop habits, ways of adapting that are useful in, say, an abusive situation, but that are maladaptive in any other situation. And once you're out of the abusive situation, you still have those habits left, and you use them to interact and to organize your life, even though they no longer are suitable. That's the reason why people who are abused go on to live, to marry abusers and all this kinds of stuff. It's one way to think about it, is because you actually learn to organize your behavior around a certain kind of relationship model, and that feels good because it's organized. It makes sense. You can predict things, and that's the number one thing humans want, is to be able to understand and predict other people's feelings and thoughts. And the number one scary thing is when we can't do that. That's why psychopaths are so incredibly scary, and we have horror movies about them and stuff, because their affect doesn't match their intentions. And so we can't predict what they're going to do. We can't understand what they're really thinking. That is very, very scary to human beings. And it's very, very, very scary to small children who have caregivers whose affect is not commensurate with what their actions are and their intentions are. Right? Lots of ways that plays out, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. Okay, so we wanted to contrast emotions with pain and reward. Nobody had ever looked at these emotions before in a neurobiological context, and they'd hardly been studied psychologically either. And then we looked at versions of these emotions that are based in physical contexts and actions. You see somebody step off the curb and break their ankle. Real, okay? It's just an accident. We didn't have any we didn't have any abuse or anything like that, because then again, that's got social implications, right? We just wanted, here's somebody playing basketball with their friends, accidentally trips and breaks their leg, and you see it break, right? It's like, oh, that looks like it really hurt. But then you feel it and then it's over. You don't really think about the social implications. And admiration for skill, where it's the same thing. You're admiring the accomplishments of a person, but now the accomplishment that you're admiring is right there in the moment, in front of you. They're solving a Rubik's Cube blindfolded and memorizing the entire thing. Or they're playing Rachmaninoff on the piano at age 12. Or they're making an incredible basketball play and shooting from the free throw line and making a dunk. Okay? The thing you admire is right there in front of you. You don't have to bring together all kinds of cumulative knowledge about the world very much to be able to appreciate that. And we wanted to understand, I wanted to understand, in part because it's very important for education, how do you move from here to here, you know? And we work on that all the time. Sally, when you pull Junie's hair, how does that make Junie feel, right? We move from here to here. And so the question I really want to answer in part is, how do we do that? And what does that process look like? And how do you grow people who can appreciate that move? From noticing circumstances in the world, coworkers, actions and what they did and why, and extract from that a generalizable principle of, so what does this mean and where are we going to go with it? That's what we need people to be able to do. And then we had control stories, which are relatively less emotional, interesting stories about people's lives. What I'm going to show you now is actually something that we really did not fully appreciate the impact of when I first designed the study. I thought it would be a neat thing to do, but it turned out to be a really important discovery, I think. And that is not the contrast. We'd originally thought the contrast this against this, pain versus reward, right? That's the traditional way these things are studied. But the contrast I'm going to show you now is about your mind versus about your body. I don't really mind if it's pain-based or reward-based. Let's just put those together and put the bottom ones together, and let's do a contrast there and look at where things are different when the emotion you're having is about someone's sort of cumulative, complex constellation of circumstances and their subjective interpretation of the meaning of those circumstances for the world versus just a context-driven, here's what you can do or here's what's happening to you right now. How does that make you feel? Does it make sense? And what we discovered is very neat. We're now down in a part of the brain that we haven't talked about yet, which is way down deep inside the middle of your head. This is a picture that slices through somebody's head this way. Again, I'm showing you the data from a whole lot of people saying, I feel really inspired, or gosh, he's such a cool basketball player. That's amazing that he could shoot that free throw. I'm really cool. I'm really thinking that's cool right now, okay? Okay, or, oh God, his broken leg looks like it really hurt. Or, oh my gosh, I can't imagine knowing, you know, that your mom died and here's all the things she did to be able to feed you and you can't go back and thank her for it now, okay? That contrast. And we're way down deep inside the middle part of the brain called the posteromedial cortices. You don't have to know that at all, but you just have to understand the separation. And what's interesting about these cortices is that, well, we're just now really starting to discover how important they are. People are really actively arguing about what goes on here. But what we found is that in these cortices, first of all, what you need to know about them is that it's thought that these cortices are important for what we call the construction of self. In other words, they're an important platform on which we build that subjective awareness of our own self. And the reason they are is not because the self is located in that part of your brain. Don't leave and say that Mary Helen said the self is over here. Instead, the reason we think they are is because of, by virtue of their anatomical placement and their role connectively. Again, it's always about the network. They are way down deep inside and they're highly what Damasio calls convergence-divergent zones. They're places where there's lots and lots of those little white tails you saw in the painting at the beginning, coming in and going out. And when we see activation there, we think it reflects a sort of coordinated activation of many networks around characteristic areas of the brain for thinking and feeling and remembering all together as one. And when my thoughts and my plans and my memories and my perceptions about the future and my feelings about right now come together with the feeling of my own body in the moment, what you get as an after effect, as an emergent property, is that sense of me. Okay? So it's not that the me is located there, it's that this is an index of heightening it and the ways in which we can heighten it. Does that make sense? Okay. What we know about this region of the brain over here, where the blue and green is, and I'll tell you what's blue and green in a second, but what we know about it is that the blood flow to that area is the best predictor of, it's the most closely correlated with how conscious you are, for example, during anesthesia. Okay? So you could be lightly anesthetized or very deeply anesthetized. When you're lightly anesthetized, you have more blood flow here. When you're very deeply anesthetized, the blood flow here is profoundly suppressed. And the blood flow here is most closely related to how deeply anesthetized you are, for example. This area is suppressed when you're sleeping, but it comes up in activation when you're dreaming. It's sort of a region that, the way I describe it in the US is that, if you know Atlanta, Georgia, right? Delta Airlines, the center hub for Delta Airlines is Atlanta, Georgia. And if you want to know something about the state of air travel in the continental US on a particular day, you can look at the Atlanta, Georgia airport as an index. Not because everybody's going to Atlanta, but because so many planes are going in and out of there. If you just look there for heightened activity, it gives you a sense of how people are moving around the whole country. Does that make sense? That's how I'm thinking about this neural system. And it's really important to understand it that way. Because even neuroscientists, there are even many neuroscientists who sort of think about this stuff in a kind of phrenological way. You know, phrenology, like where they studied in the 1800s bumps on people's skulls and how they correspond to their traits and characteristics. Right? They're really just doing the same thing with fancy statistical algorithms and machines. But they're finding little orange spots all over the place and saying that it's for this and it's for that. And that's not how the brain works. It's really actually much more nuanced and complex. And I just want you to understand that. But what we found is that within these cortices, that seem to be very activated when you're kind of aware of yourself, there was a subdivision that the brain kind of honored between, exactly along this distinction, between emotions about people's sort of contextualized situations, their physical pains, their skills and abilities, and their kind of mental situations. So more activity for these kind of mental, social situations is here, and more for kind of physical situations is there. Why is that interesting, that the brain honors that distinction? And this was a novel discovery in that paper. Why is that interesting? Well, we can start to think about why it's interesting if we appreciate the anatomical connectivity that underlies these two regions. So up here, Joseph Parvizi's work and other people's work has shown us in the macaque monkey, and they have very similar brain organization to us, that anatomically, the little white tails, those ribbons I showed you in the painting, right, are connected, heavily interconnected with lateral parietal systems on the side of your head that allow you to feel and represent proprioception for your musculoskeletal body. In other words, you have a left leg right now, right? But you probably weren't thinking about it until I told you. And now you're aware of it. But even though you weren't thinking about it, you weren't kicking the person next to you with it. You weren't sitting on it in a way that was hurting it. Okay? Why not? Because you've got a map of those those body parts in the sides of your parietal lobes that's regulating and organizing their action for you. And so what it looks like is when you're appreciating and emotionally reacting to a situation, to a person's situation, that is about their sort of physical abilities and skills and pains in the moment, in the context, you use high-level integrative cortices. You use kind of a kind of a reading out of the state of your own musculoskeletal body. By contrast, when you think about another person's mind, you don't use this area very much. Instead, you're invoking a different area. How is this area anatomically interconnected? This area is basically feeling, it's a central part of a system in the brain that's been called, thanks to Marcus Rinkel's first study of this in 2001, this is very new stuff, called the brain's so-called default mode. Okay, and I'll explain that in a minute, but basically it's a core set of regions around the brain's center which seem to feel and regulate the state of your internal body and your consciousness. They're heavily interconnected with parts of the brain whose job it is to regulate your physiology, your autonomic nervous system, your reactivity, to feel the activity that's going on inside those mesencephalic nuclei, the midbrain there that keep you conscious as opposed to in a coma, the ones that if you get damage there, you end up in persistent vegetative state and stuff like that. They're feeling and regulating that. They're telling you about a sense of kind of well-being in general of your insides. So what's interesting here is that it looks like emotions we have about other people's situations are divided in the brain. And for sure in real life you're doing both all the time, but in this experimental design we managed to separate them functionally. Divided in the brain between appreciation of sort of contextualized circumstances that have to do with what you're doing versus, and that goes on your musculoskeletal body, versus mental implications of what you're doing, bless you, which goes on your internal gut body. Now here's the part that I think is very interesting for you. It just so happens that this internally focused network seems to be relatively incompatible, neurologically speaking, to activate when you are focusing on the outside world. So you know right now, when I'm talking to you, in order for you to learn something from this lecture, you need to actually be paying attention to what I'm saying and trying to remember it and learn it and internalize it. You're not deeply reflecting and daydreaming and imagining about the meaning of it for your life very much, right? You're not feeling the meaning of it internally because you'd miss what I'm saying if you did that, right? You might be able to do some of that because you're very skilled learners. You can sort of flip back and forth very quickly and monitor what you're paying attention to. But if you stay in there too long, you're going to miss what I had to say. So it looks like we have a kind of outwardly focused attention system and a sort of inwardly focused attention system, and that they toggle with one another in ways that we're still scientifically trying to discover. But what's interesting for you is that it looks like, and this is what this Rest is Not Idleness paper is about, it looks like the neural systems that allow you to appreciate the moral and psychological and emotional and abstract and long-term implications of a person's situation, you know, that allow you to admire that woman in Sudan, and not just the way she's holding the book, but the kind of person she is, play themselves out on cortices that are relatively incompatible to activate with externally focused distraction and attention. So if you're being asked to pay attention out here, you probably can't, especially in young people who are not very facile at moving back and forth between these attention systems, you probably can't be activating this too. And yet, what do we do in education settings? On task is learning Daydreaming is not. No, yeah. We keep kids focusing out here all the time. And now, of course, it is extremely important that you can learn to monitor and engage and sustain your outwardly directed focus. For sure. If you couldn't right now, you would not get anything out of this lecture, right? But where do we teach kids the kinds of thinking and skills that happen apparently, this is my hypothesis, okay, that happen apparently during internally focused reflection? We don't have time and skills for that built into our child development experiences, but the brain research suggests that they're very, very important. These regions of the brain are now known to be very active when you're recalling personally relevant memories. Not memories for facts, memories for things that happened to you that were meaningful, that made you learn in a real sense. So it suggests that if we want kids to connect what they're learning to their real life, you know, as decades and centuries of educational literature really have told us, if we want them to make meaning of it in a deep way, it may be that that kind of meaning is made during internally focused reflective states. Which suggests that we need to understand more about those states, the dimensions of thought that happen there, and it suggests that we need to develop curricula that teach kids how and when to move into these states and to move into externally focused states, what kind of thinking is done best in each one, and how to monitor their own attention and move back and forth effectively between them. Does that make sense? Okay. So just to kind of make it concrete, you know, what does this discovery mean for kids who live, for example, in urban environments that aren't safe or in family lives that aren't safe? If these kids develop this kind of heightened sense of vigilance into the environment because they have to, are we predisposing them toward activating this network too much and not this one enough? And I'm not saying you need all this, right? You absolutely need both. What we want is balance and an ability to mindfully control which one you're in accordance with the needs of the situation. If every time I wanted to go to the store and buy Cheerios, right, I sat and deeply reflected on the meaning of that decision, I